Ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to use an oversized visual poster displayed during my remarks.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Okay. And I ask unanimous consent that Senator Wyden be added as a co-sponsor to my resolution SJ Res 54.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today along with Senator Murphy and Senator Lee to talk about one of the most important jobs that the United States Congress has, and that is to fulfill its constitutional responsibility about whether or not the United States of America engages in military action. We can disagree about the merits of this or that military action, but there should be absolutely no confusion that sending men and women of the United States military into conflict is the responsibility not of the President of the United States alone, but of the United States Congress. And let us be very clear, and I say this especially to my conservative friends who talk about the Constitution all of the time. Let me remind you what Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says in no uncertain terms. And that is, and I quote, "Congress shall have the power to declare war," end of quote. The Founding Fathers gave the power to declare war to Congress, the branch most accountable to the people. For far too long, Congress, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, has, in my view, abdicated its constitutional role in authorizing war. And we are moving down a very, very slippery slope where Congress is now becoming increasingly irrelevant in terms of that vitally important issue. And in my view, the time is long overdue for Congress to reassert its constitutional authority. And that is why Senators Lee, Senator Murphy, and I, that is what we are doing with Senate Joint Resolution 54, and I'm proud to have as co-sponsors on that resolution Senator Durbin, Senator Booker, Senator Warren, Senator Leahy, Senator Markey, Senator Feinstein, and Senator Wyden. Mr. President, many Americans are unaware that the people of Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world, are suffering terribly today in a devastating civil war, with Saudi Arabia and their allies on one side and Houthi rebels on the other. In November of last year, the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator said that Yemen was on the brink, quote, of the largest famine the world has seen for many decades. So far, thousands of civilians have died. The last count that I have seen is about 10,000. Over 40,000 have been wounded in the war. 15 million people lack access to clean water and sanitation in an infrastructure which has been devastated. More than 20 million people in Yemen, over two-thirds of the population, need some kind of humanitarian support, with nearly 10 million people in acute need of assistance. This is a humanitarian disaster. And the picture here, this very, very sad picture of a young child facing starvation, is what is taking place throughout this country. Sadly, this is not the only child in that position. Famine is a serious and growing problem in Yemen. Further, more than 1 million suspected cholera cases have been reported, representing potentially the worst cholera outbreak in world history. The pictures that I have here today taken by photojournalists in Yemen attest to this human disaster. Many Americans, and this is, one of the problems that we have, is that unfortunately foreign policy is not an issue that we talk about enough down here on the floor, and certainly not talked about enough in the media. But many Americans today are not aware that American forces have been actively engaged in support of the Saudi coalition in this war, providing intelligence and aerial refueling of planes whose bombs have killed thousands of people and made this crisis far worse. My colleagues and I, along with all of our co-sponsors, believe that as Congress has not declared war or authorized military force in this conflict, the United States' involvement in Yemen is unconstitutional and unauthorized, and U.S. military support of the Saudi coalition must end. Without congressional authorization, our engagement in this war should be restricted to providing desperately needed humanitarian aid and diplomatic efforts to resolve this terrible civil war. And that is why Senator Lee and Senator Murphy and I introduced this joint resolution pursuant to the 1973 War Powers Resolution calling for an end to U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. The War Powers Resolution defines the introduction of U.S. armed forces to include, quote, the assignment of members of such armed forces to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of, or accompany the regular or irregular forces of any foreign country or government when such military forces are engaged or there exists an imminent threat that such forces will become engaged in hostilities, end of quote. Assisting with targeting, intelligence, and refueling warplanes as they bomb those targets clearly meet this definition. And I'm going to yield now, but just reiterate the point, and I look forward to a colloquy with Senator Lee and with Senator Murphy. Here is the bottom line. If the United States Congress wants to go to war in Yemen, vote on that war. But I believe, and the co-sponsors of this legislation do not believe, that the authority to go to war is now appropriate. And we think what is going on now is unconstitutional, and unless Congress authorizes this war, it should be ended and ended immediately. And with that, I would yield to Senator Lee, who has been very active on this issue from day one. Senator Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, and thanks for your leadership on this. It's an honor to be here with my friend and colleague, the Senator from Vermont, to talk about our joint resolution to force a vote on U.S. military involvement in a civil war going on in Yemen. Whether you're present in the Senate chamber today or whether you're tuning in from home, I hope you'll listen closely for the next hour or so that we can fill you in on the unauthorized Middle East war that your United States government is supporting. This war in Yemen has killed tens of thousands of innocent victims, human beings, lest we forget, each with immeasurable, innate, God-given dignity. This war has created refugees, orphans, and widows. It has cost many millions of dollars. And believe it or not, at the end of the day, according to at least one U.S. government report, it has arguably undermined our fight against terrorist threats such as ISIS, rather than advancing those efforts. I'll expand on these uncomfortable facts here in a few minutes. But for now, let's focus on just one thing. Our military's involvement in Yemen has not been authorized by the United States Congress, as is required by the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is pretty clear on this point. It says that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Congress, not the President, not the Pentagon, but Congress. This is the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. And it makes sense that this power would only be granted to that branch of government. Yet, in 2015, President Obama initiated our military involvement in Yemen without permission from Congress, without an authorization for the use of military force, without a declaration of war. The current administration has continued Obama's war. So Senator Sanders and I, along with Senator Murphy and our 6 other co-sponsors, are giving Congress a chance to fix this error by debating and voting on our nation's continued involvement in this illegal, unauthorized war in Yemen. Now, if, as our opponents claim, if this war is necessary, then surely they'll be willing to come down to this floor within the Senate chamber and defend it. Surely they'll be willing to come onto the floor of the Senate and onto the floor of the House and seek authorization from Congress as the Constitution demands. Let's have an honest reckoning about this war today. Now, at this very moment, a tragedy is unfolding in Yemen. And very sadly, it's a tragedy for which our nation shares some blame. Here are just a few facts about this war in Yemen, which is now approaching its 3rd year. 15 million human souls in Yemen lack clean water and sanitation. 8 million are at risk of starvation. The Yemeni people have been visited by the worst cholera outbreak in recorded human history, over 1 million cases. Every 10 minutes, a child under the age of 5 dies of preventable causes. A total of 10,000 civilians have been killed in this war. 40,000 more civilians have been wounded in this war. I think it's important to discuss the human toll that this war is inflicting. And I think it's especially important to have discussions like this one at the outset, so that as we go into a conflict, the stakes are clear. For thousands of human beings, the decision we make in this chamber will make the difference between life and death. This is one of the many reasons why it's so important to keep reminding ourselves that the Founding Fathers were really clear about this. They didn't leave any real ambiguity in terms of identifying who has the power to make a decision like this one. Who has the power to decide when we go to war? Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Now, from time to time, I hear it argued that declarations of war are somehow antiquated. They're outdated. They're anachronisms, akin to ceremonial relics like powdered wigs or the keys to the city, akin to a society whose principal mode of transportation involved a horse and a buggy. But it isn't true. These principles are as true today as they were then. Nothing about those principles has become outdated. If you read the Founding Fathers, it is really clear that they thought the power to declare war was, in fact, important. And they deliberately considered the matter and withheld it from the president for a reason. They did not vest this power in the office of the presidency. And that was a conscious, deliberate, and I believe wise choice. To quote Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 69, the Founding Fathers wanted their president to be much inferior in power to a king. Kings declare war unilaterally. They can make life or death military decisions on a whim if they want to, and they don't need to go and seek support from the public before doing so. In our system, presidents, by contrast, have to garner the support of the public and of the legislative branch before initiating wars. Far from a unilateral decision, the decision to go to war in America is supposed to be based on collaboration and consensus so that our nation will be united to the greatest degree possible. when we go through trying conflicts, at that moment when unity is what's so badly needed. So, which does the modern executive resemble more today? A president, as the founding fathers understood that term, or a king? The answer is uncomfortably clear from the string of unauthorized military excursions that presidents from both political parties have initiated in recent decades. Now, of course, some people claim that the president has broad constitutional authority to make war as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, they're absolutely right. The President of the United States is, in fact, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. But this is not the beginning and the end of the question. This does not mean the President may authorize at will military excursions around the globe for any reason or no reason at all without authorization from Congress. It does not mean that. It means nothing close to that. Only Congress can authorize a military campaign. Once Congress has done so, then the President has broad authority, vast discretion to decide how specifically to command the armed forces to victory. Now, there is one important, notable exception to this bedrock principle, and that exception arises specifically in the event of an attack on the United States. The founders, you see, were wise, and they anticipated that there could be threats to the homeland so serious that it might be physically impossible for Congress to respond quickly enough. So they reserved for the president the power to, quote, repel sudden attacks, close quote, in the words of James Madison. But clearly, this strategy, we might describe it as a break glass in case of emergency kind of strategy. It's that kind of power. It is a break glass in times of emergency kind of power. It's supposed to be used only under extreme, extraordinary circumstances, when Congress cannot convene in time to save the nation. The founders did not intend for the commander-in-chief power to be used to justify military intervention in civil wars 8,000 miles away. That authorization can come only from this body, in the form of a declaration of war or in the form of an authorization for the use of military force. To date, we have not considered either one of these, much less voted on them and passed them in the case of this civil war in Yemen. So I'd ask my colleague, Senator Sanders from Vermont, how long can the American people be expected to ignore our involvement in a foreign war?
Well, before I answer that very important question, and thank you very much for your remarks, Senator Lee. I think you were right on virtually everything you said. I want to bring Senator Murphy into this colloquy. Senator Murphy has been ahead of his time on focusing attention on what's going on in Yemen, and he is one of the original sponsors. Senator Murphy, what's your thoughts on this issue?
Thank you very much, Senator Sanders. Thank you, Senator Lee, for allowing me to step in and say a few words before we have a short colloquy about the resolution that we're bringing before the floor. I've brought this chart down to the floor before, and I hesitate to keep it, this picture up to the floor before, and I hesitate to keep it up for more than a few moments. It's very, very disturbing to look at, but this is the reality of Yemen today. This is the reality of a country in which thousands and thousands of civilians have been killed by a bombing campaign that the United States is facilitating with intelligence sharing, facilitating with targeting assistance, facilitating with mid-air refueling, facilitating with the sale of munitions that end up being dropped on the homes of families like this. This is, as has been stated, perhaps the worst cholera outbreak in modern history. And let's talk about why that happens. Why are over 1 million people in Yemen today suffering from cholera, a disease that is entirely 100% preventable? The reason is that the water treatment facilities inside Yemen have been bombed, have been rendered useless. such that there is no means by which you can keep the water that these young children drink clean. Bombs sold to the Saudi coalition by the United States, bombs dropped from planes refueled by the United States Air Force, bombs that are directed via targeting centers in which U.S. personnel are embedded, hit water treatment facilities inside Yemen, such that there is now the worst cholera outbreak in our lifetime. I can't do a better job than Senator Lee did of explaining to the body why we believe that it is so important for Congress to exercise our Article I responsibility to declare war. He laid it out better than I can. But the Founding Fathers believed, as he said, that when there were matters of great import to the national security of this country, when there were decisions that the executive was making with respect to hostilities with other nations that included serious consequences for the United States and the world, that should not be simply an executive function. Very specifically, as Senator Lee said, that power of declaring war, of entering into hostilities against another nation, is housed here in the Congress. And so it is relevant to talk about what is happening in Yemen today, what is the degree of the hostilities, and does it come with serious national security concerns for the United States of America, for the constituents that we represent. We are absolutely engaged in hostilities today. There is no way that what you see in these charts could not be categorized as hostilities. The bombs that ruined this entire neighborhood, once again, are made in the United States, are dropped by planes refueled by the United States, are directed by a targeting center that involves U.S. personnel. This is clearly an act of hostility that the U.S., in partnership with the Saudi coalition, has entered into against the Yemeni people. Remember, this is a civil war inside Yemen, and there are not so good people on both sides of this civil war. The Houthis have been responsible for major catastrophic acts in the country, just as the coalition has. But we are only on one side of that, so it makes sense for us to focus on the hostilities that have been entered into by the United States and Saudi coalition. But let's just for a second talk about the other implications for U.S. national security. What has happened inside Yemen as this civil war has persisted? Al-Qaeda and ISIS have grown in strength. For a period of time, AQAP, the arm of Al-Qaeda inside Yemen that has the most direct intentions to hit the United States, had captured a major port inside Yemen and was drawing substantial revenue, allowing them to become stronger than ever before. By continuing to feed weapons into this civil war, the United States is helping to expand the reach and the power of the two entities inside Yemen that the administration argues they do have authorization to fight, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And many of us would draw issue with the interpretation of an AUMF passed a decade and a half ago as it applies to ISIS. But no doubt the administration has the ability to pursue war against Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is growing in strength because of the continuation of this civil war. If you talk to Yemeni Americans, they will tell you that inside Yemen, this is not seen as a Saudi bombing campaign. This is seen as a U.S. Saudi bombing campaign. And what they will further tell you is that Yemenis are becoming radicalized against the United States because there is a U.S. imprint on every single bomb that is dropped and every single civilian death inside that country. And while we may talk a good game about humanitarian relief, we may enter into occasional efforts to settle this conflict through negotiations, all they know is that for 3 years, the United States has been supporting a Saudi bombing campaign that does not end, We have been supporting a Saudi-led coalition that has blocked humanitarian relief from entering this country. You may hear a lot about the money that the Saudis are putting into humanitarian relief. You don't hear as much about the fact that at one point they completely closed the port through which the majority of humanitarian relief flows. And though now it is technically open, they are still narrowing the channel greatly through which relief supplies get to this country. And so nobody should applaud the United States or the Saudis for providing relief to a country that they indeed are bombing. I am not setting aside the culpability of the Houthis for substantial atrocities in this civil war as well, but we are only on one side of it. This is clearly covered by the powers vested in the United States Congress to make war. And if it isn't, it unlocks a horrific Pandora's box. If the president can enter into hostilities against another country, so long as all they are doing is providing vast logistical support to a coalition partner, then there is no end to what the president can do, so long as he doesn't put a troop on the ground. Our involvement in the Saudi-led coalition has serious national security implications for the United States, aside from the fact that it has resulted in the death of thousands of civilians and has set off the worst humanitarian catastrophe that the world has seen today. So, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I just want to bring these consequences to bear for our colleagues to think about, our colleagues who may not think that this rises to the powers invested in the Congress by the Constitution. There are very few more serious conflicts with respect to consequences to the United States than this one. And so I guess I would wrap back around that question that Senator Lee posed to Senator Sanders. If the United States doesn't weigh in here, then when? What is the precedent that is set by Congress continuing to remain silent even when you have a humanitarian catastrophe and a set of consequences to U.S. national security that are this big?
Well, let me thank Senator Murphy for his comments and Senator Lee before that. I think they touched on the most important issues, and I want to respond to what Senator Lee and Senator Murphy both said. But I want to make a point that needs to be made again and again. This is not a partisan issue. We're talking about Democratic administrations acting militarily without congressional authorization. We're talking about Republican administrations doing the same. Senator Lee is a conservative Republican. Senator Murphy is a Democrat. I am an independent who caucuses with the Democrats. So if you're talking about bipartisanship, you're looking at it right here. And I should tell you that there are many organizations around the country, conservative and progressive, who are raising exactly the same issue that we are raising right here. And that is Congress has got to reassert its congressional authority over the issues of war. If you want to go to war, if you think the war in Yemen makes sense, that's fine. Come down here on the floor, tell us why you feel that way, tell the American people, tell your constituents why you think it is a good idea to work with Saudi Arabia to wreak utter horror on one of the poorest countries in the world. Fine, come on down and tell us. But what we have got to do from a precedent point of view is finally say to a Republican president, a Democratic president, enough is enough. Listen to the Constitution. The founding fathers of this country were amazingly smart on this issue. And they understood that before we send our young men and now women off into war to die, to get maimed, there better well be a very good reason that we have to explain to the people who elected us, not just somebody sitting up there in the Oval Office. And that is why the authority for going to war is vested in the representatives of the people who are elected for 2 years or elected for 6 years. And I would also point out that this is not the first time that the U.S. Congress has weighed in on the devastating war in Yemen. In November of last year, the House of Representatives, and I hope my Senate colleagues know this, by a vote of 366 to 30, not even close, overwhelming support among Democrats and Republicans, they passed a non-binding resolution stating that the United States' involvement in the Yemen civil war is unauthorized. Democratic leadership supported, and as did the Republican chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce. So, Mr. President, here is the bottom line. The bottom line is that Congress has ducked its responsibility for many years, and if we continue to duck our responsibility on the all-important issue of U.S. military intervention, this Congress, and in fact the people of the United States, become increasingly irrelevant on this most important matter. So we are bringing forward a privileged motion. There will be a vote on this issue in one form or another. And if you like the war in Yemen, then be prepared to defend why you think it is a great idea to work with the Saudis to destroy the infrastructure, to create a situation where famine and cholera is rampant in that terribly poor country. Come on down and tell us why you think it's a good idea. If not, I hope that you will vote with us to end this war, to allow the United States to get involved in bringing the warring parties together, to see if we can bring peace, to see if we can bring humanitarian relief to these terribly suffering people. And with that, I would yield to Senator Lee.
Thank you. And Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to display an oversized visual display.
Is there objection? Objection.
I'm not sure what constitutes oversized, but I have it on good authority that the ordinary Senate rules don't allow for a picture this big. Without unanimous consent, I therefore sought it. The picture itself paints an image and leaves an impression that is itself oversized, that itself demonstrates the humanity of this conflict. You see a child standing in what appears to be a school, in an ordinary learning environment that's been rendered unusable by the devastating impact of war. Now, war does happen, conflicts do arise. This is one of the reasons why it was built into not only our system of laws, but our foundational governing structure in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers understood that war would arise from time to time, but they carefully divided up the power, recognizing how devastating its implications can be, recognizing that bad things are a little bit less likely to happen if you don't allow too much power to be concentrated in the hands of the few. Over time, Congress and the presidency have had a little bit of a tug of war, as I referenced earlier, about where the commander-in-chief power ends and the war power begins. In 1973, Congress reasserted its constitutional role and tried to clarify some of what had been described as gray area by passing the War Powers Resolution. The crisis that led Congress to create this important law in many ways was reminiscent of the conflict that we're discussing today. The War Powers Act was passed in response to the Vietnam War. That war began with the insertion of just a small handful of U.S. military advisors in 1950. But their ranks grew and grew, gradually but steadily, so that our commitment in Vietnam spiraled into a decades-long, bloody conflagration. Presidents from both parties abused their authority in order to wage this far-off war. Finally, in 1973, Congress decided it was time to bring our boys home. So it repealed the limited legal authority for the war it had granted to then President Johnson 7 years earlier. In defiance of Congress, President Nixon continued the war, citing his authority as commander-in-chief. So Congress drafted the War Powers Resolution to give itself a way to remove our armed services personnel from unauthorized, unlawful, unconstitutional war zones. The War Powers Resolution states that the President must notify Congress within 48 hours of committing American troops to hostilities or imminent hostilities. The War Powers Resolution goes on to provide that the President must remove troops from the conflict if Congress does not authorize their presence within 60 days, or in a maximum of 90 days in the case of certain emergencies. Congress's passage of the War Powers Resolution was a bold assertion of its constitutional responsibility in the face of a chronically overreaching executive branch. In fact, Congress's desire to uphold the Constitution was so strong that it actually overrode President Nixon's veto of the War Powers Resolution. Members of Congress today could certainly learn a thing or two from their predecessors' commitment to constitutional duties, to the limited power possessed by each branch of government. Now, since the War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973, defenders of a royal executive have tried to go around it, tried to circumvent it altogether by claiming that their unauthorized wars somehow do not qualify as hostilities. We heard this claim by President Obama in response to Libya, and we heard it again in response to Yemen. It is the official position of the U.S. Department of Defense that we are not engaged in hostilities in Yemen unless our troops, quote, are actively engaged in exchanges of fire with opposing units of hostile forces, close quote. To translate, the U.S. government really claims that it's not engaged in hostilities unless U.S. troops are on the ground being shot at by the enemy. Now, it stretches the imagination, and it stretches the English language beyond its breaking point to assert that our military is not engaged in hostilities in Yemen. Consider for a moment what it is that the U.S. military is doing as part of the Saudi-led coalition effort against the neighbors of Saudi Arabia, against the Saudi-led coalition's Yemeni neighbors. U.S. military personnel are assigned to the Joint Combined Planning Cell in Saudi Arabia, where they're sharing military intelligence with the Saudis and helping to target enemies within Yemen for attack. Our forces are also refueling coalition bombers mid-air on combat missions. If sending our military men and women to foreign lands to fuel a country's bombers and handpick its targets does not qualify as hostilities, then those words have lost their meaning. What does the word hostility mean if it cannot be said to encompass that? But as it happens, the War Powers Resolution was designed to stop secret, unauthorized military activities such as these. So Congress is well within its right to vote on whether these activities should continue. That's why this joint resolution, authored by Senator Sanders and co-sponsored by Senator Murphy and myself and 6 others, represents a big chance, a significant chance, a constitutional moment for Congress to do the right thing, for Congress to do its job, for Congress to represent the American people. This, after all, is their blood and their treasure that's being put on the line. That's why the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution alike contemplate action by Congress and not solely unilateral action by the executive branch. So I would ask my colleagues, Senator Sanders and Senator Murphy, isn't it arguable that by overreaching in this instance, we might in fact be making matters worse? Couldn't we be putting our country in a position of less security rather than more?
Well, Senator Lee, I think that is an excellent question. That was just the question that I was going to ask of Senator Murphy. because I think we understand that in recent history, when there is chaos and confusion in a country, it provides an extraordinary opportunity for Al-Qaeda and their allies to move in. And we have spent billions and billions of dollars fighting Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. And I fear very much, as you've indicated, that the situation we're creating in Yemen is in many ways making life easier for them. But I would ask Senator Murphy, and maybe listeners might be surprised by this, what side of this battle is Al-Qaeda on in Yemen right now?
Senator Sanders, thank you for the question. This is incredibly important to understand. There was great consternation at the beginning of this civil war when the United States, under the Obama administration, was beginning to support the Saudi-led coalition, that the Saudis were only targeting the Houthis. And as the Al-Qaeda wing inside Yemen was getting stronger and stronger, no matter how much we asked, no matter how much we pushed, the Saudi-led coalition would not drop bombs on the Al-Qaeda, would not drop bombs on Al-Qaeda, would not send any of their forces near them. They were only focused on the Houthis. And the answer as to why that was happening is very simple. The enemy of your enemy tends to be your ally. And inside Yemen, the Houthis were drawing fire from both the Saudi-led coalition and from Al-Qaeda. And so in the early stages of this fight, the policy of the Saudi-led coalition was to have hands off of Al-Qaeda, and that made Al-Qaeda stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, admittedly, recently, we have been more successful in getting the Emiratis, not necessarily the Saudis, to take on targeted missions against Al-Qaeda, but that is only a recent phenomenon. And it is frankly belied by the fact that we have new information that at the same time that the Emiratis are occasionally taking out operations, and sometimes dangerous operations at risk of life to their forces against Al-Qaeda, they are also supporting other militias inside Yemen, Salafist militias, that are in many ways just as radical as Al-Qaeda is, and are recruiting the type of troops that one day may join ISIS and one day may join Al-Qaeda, targeting against the United States. And so this is a very chaotic space in which very purposefully for a period of time, the coalition allowed for Al-Qaeda to grow. And even though that policy has changed recently, there are still signs that there are some very dangerous people to the United States that are being supported on the ground by members of our coalition. I know Senator Durbin is here, and so I want to turn it over to him. I just want to say two more quick things on this point. One is to note that our resolution does continue to allow for the United States to target Al-Qaeda. We build into this resolution a carve-out for any military activities that are currently authorized by the 2001 AUMF, and the administration interprets that to be Al-Qaeda and affiliated follow-on organizations. So let's be clear that if you care about the United States targeting Al-Qaeda, that can continue here. Finally, to Senator Lee's point about this interpretation of hostilities, let's be clear how narrow a definition that is. There have to be American troops on the ground exchanging fire in order for the War Powers Act to be triggered. That is not what Congress intended, because, in fact, then, that would allow the administration to perpetuate an unlimited air campaign, dropping unlimited munitions, devastating, ruining a country without any input from Congress. And even if you would say, well, that does involve U.S. personnel flying overhead, so maybe that is potentially putting U.S. troops in the line of fire. Remember, we are also entering an era of robotic warfare in which U.S. personnel are going to be less instrumental to hostilities that will still have grave consequences to the United States. And so clearly, the notion of war and how you fight it has changed over the years. The Founding Fathers never imagined air campaigns, and yet the intent and the language of the War Powers Act and of the Constitution is clear. When war is being waged, when hostilities are being entered into, Congress has to have a say. And please look at any of the pictures that we are putting before you and tell us that the United States is not engaged in hostilities if the effect in the country of Yemen is this. I thank Senator Durbin for joining us on the floor today, and I'd yield to him.
I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Sanders, Senator Murphy, and Senator Lee, for this bipartisan effort. Why are we here today? Why are we discussing wars so far away? We're here because of this book. This is the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution very expressly tells us what we're supposed to be doing here. In Article 1, Section 8, it lays out the things that we are responsible for, the men and women who serve in Congress. And among the things that Congress shall have the power to do is to, quote, declare war. Declare war. Why did the Founding Fathers make certain that it was clear that Congress would be involved in that decision on the declaration of war? Because when they created Congress, the idea was that the people of this country, far and wide, would at least have a voice in the decision through the people they elected. And we would be held accountable for our decisions to declare war or not declare it, because we're up for election. So Congress has this responsibility, and over the years, Congress has not exercised this responsibility in a responsible way many times. I've got a question. I'll bet you if I brought in every United States senator and asked them the following question, very few would be able to answer it. How many countries is the United States military currently involved in fighting? How many countries are we in today fighting? Would you guess 2? Iraq, Afghanistan, all right, for sure there. 5, 10, 20. Brown University's Cost of War Project recently published data saying that the U.S. fought terror through direct fighting, training, or military support to other forces, or through drone strikes in 76 countries between October 2015 and 2017. Is that the right number today? I'm not sure. None of us know. We're often surprised to learn we are sending our military and fighting in another country. And when something awful occurs, Americans are killed, for example, sometimes members of Congress hear for the first time, oh, we're in what country fighting? I take this pretty seriously, and I have over the years, when it comes to the authorization of using force, because it isn't just a matter of projecting American power, it is life and death. These are decisions that will be made by Congress or by the President, sometimes both, and the net result of it, even under the best of circumstances, is that Americans will perish. Funerals will be held in Illinois, in Utah, in Vermont, and in Connecticut, and in Wisconsin. That's the reality of the decisions that we reach. I can remember the debate right after 9/11 on the floor. It was one of the most important of my career. And it was a question about whether or not we would authorize the President of the United States, President Bush at the time, to use military force to respond to 9/11. If you remember the debate, there were 2 real options on the floor. One was to use military force against those responsible for the attack on the United States and to send that force into Afghanistan. The other was to go after the so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. 2 parallel debates, but 2 debates that I saw very differently. I was skeptical from the start about this Iraqi invasion. Nobody ever connected the dots between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. We were talking about the threat that he was to the rest of the world. And yet we voted here on the floor of the United States Senate in 2002 to authorize the use of military force to go into Iraq. Sadly, we're still there today. Sadly, Iraq is in shambles, politically and physically, and the war continues. I voted no. I remember that night because it was in October in 2002, and I remember that night because The vote was taken very late, and there were 2 or 3 of us who stayed on the floor here, Kent Conrad, as well as Paul Wellstone of Minnesota. Paul Wellstone was up for re-election. We wondered if that vote would affect him in any way, and I remember going up to him and saying, Paul, I hope that vote, your vote against the war in Iraq, doesn't cost you the election. And Wellstone said to me, it's all right if it does. People know where I stand. They expect nothing less. He didn't live to see the election. If you'll remember, he died in a plane crash with his wife and staffers just a few days after that vote. But that's the gravity of this decision. That's the importance of this decision, and that's why I want to thank my colleagues for bringing us together, just a few of us, but enough of us maybe, in the Senate to remind people of our constitutional responsibility. The vote on Afghanistan was when I voted for the invasion of Afghanistan. The message was clear: you attack the United States, we'll come right back after you, Al-Qaeda, and we did. I recently asked the Secretary of Defense, when I voted that way in 2002, I did not imagine that 15 or 16 years later, that war would continue. How does this war ever end in Afghanistan? He didn't know the answer, didn't come up with one. All he could say to me was, if we left, it would be worse. Well, you can say that a lot about other countries in the world, but what we're talking about today is what we are going to do in terms of this horrid situation in Yemen. I was in my office looking down on this debate through C-SPAN, and I saw the photos that have been displayed here, the utter human and physical devastation that has taken place. Mr. President, Senator Sanders is asking a simple but deeply important question here today. Senator Lee and Senator Murphy join him. Here is the question: who authorized the United States military action to help Saudi Arabia fight the Houthis in Yemen? I didn't. I don't remember that there was ever a vote. So how are we doing this? By what authority is our government doing this? This is not about the merits of the fight in any way, or a vindication of the Houthis' troubling role in the horrific Yemeni civil war. It's about whether Congress follows its constitutional responsibilities. It's whether the American people have a voice in this decision, the same people who will send their sons and daughters to bravely serve in our military. So I'm happy to be a co-sponsor of this resolution that halts any such U.S. support without congressional authorization. I call on this Congress to deal with revisiting the 2001-2002 authorizations of force that I believe have been stretched by multiple administrations beyond any credible limit. There are real threats to the safety and security of America out there, Al-Qaeda and its successors, and others. But we in Congress have the responsibility to authorize those conflicts and regularly update them as necessary. Congress and the Senate have been absent without leave when it comes to Article 1, Section 8, and our authority and responsibility to declare war. We have other looming threats, North Korea, Iran, but any U.S. war against those countries or others, short of protecting against an imminent attack as allowed under the War Powers Resolution, requires the vote of Congress, regardless of who the president may be. Mr. President, when it comes to the declaration of war, we simply cannot see this as an annoyance. We must do our part. We must follow the Constitution, even when it's difficult. I yield the floor.
Senator Durbin, thank you very much for your perceptive remarks and reminding us that the time is long overdue for the United States Congress to accept its constitutional responsibilities. I wanted to ask Senator Lee if he had, we're running out of time here, if you had some closing remarks, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. I appreciate your remarks, your leadership on this, and I appreciate the remarks that Senator Durbin and Senator Murphy have added to this discussion. I wanted to close by pointing out that in addition to being unlawful, in addition to being unconstitutional, our involvement in Yemen is unproductive in the fight against terrorism. The Houthis we are fighting are a regional force, one that doesn't harbor ambitions of attacking the United States homeland. And while the Houthis are certainly no friend of ours, neither are they a serious threat to our country. Yet we're diverting considerable resources to fighting the Houthis, resources that would be better spent fighting more substantial threats, threats that harbor rather openly ambitions of bringing down the United States, of attacking the United States. Threats like al-Qaeda or ISIS. And on that point, the best evidence we have suggests that our involvement in Yemen has arguably undermined our fight against ISIS. The State Department's most recent study, its most recent country reports on terrorism, says that which, by the way, happens to be the authority on that subject for Congress and the American people. It says that we have inadvertently strengthened ISIS by killing off its antagonists, the Houthis. This just reinforces the farcical character that our military excursions in the Middle East have the potential to undertake. We bomb with one hand, we give humanitarian aid with the other hand, we whack a terrorist from one group and another springs up in its place. Defenders of our efforts in this war in Yemen often claim that the real reason we're fighting the Houthis is because they are a proxy for Iran, which is the true threat to our nation and to the world. This would be perhaps a reasonable rationale, but there are conflicting reports about the Houthis and their ties to Iran. Iran has expansionist views. The Houthis do not. Hezbollah is an officially listed foreign terrorist organization. The Houthis are not. The Houthis may be a rogue non-state actor destabilizing their own country, but they're not a threat to America, not at least yet. By helping the Saudis bomb them, we only give the Houthis reasons to start to hate us. Our involvement in Yemen, then, detracts from our ability to be a diplomatic resource and the peacemaker in the region. And so, in closing, the substance of the resolution offered by Senator Sanders and co-sponsored by Senator Murphy, myself, and others is simple. It puts our war against the Houthi rebels to a vote. It concerns the Houthis, and only the Houthis. If members are convinced that our fight against the Houthis is worthwhile, then so be it. Congress will have done its part, and the fight will go on. But if members are not willing to pay the heavy price tag for this war, calculated in dollars and in innocent human lives, then our resolution will bring U.S. operations to a close. This resolution is an opportunity for members of Congress to stand up and be counted on a matter of life and death. It's an opportunity to end the executive's unconstitutional dominance over matters of war and peace and restore in its place a collaborative process whereby Congress declares war and presidents wage war. Thank you, Senator Sanders.
Let me conclude by thanking Senator Lee, Senator Murphy, Senator Durbin for their remarks this afternoon, thanking Senator Booker, Senator Warren, Senator Leahy, Senator Markey, Senator Feinstein, and Senator Wyden for their co-sponsorship of Joint Resolution 54. And let me summarize it very briefly in this way. Congress cannot continue to abdicate its responsibility on the all-important issue of how and when the United States becomes involved in military intervention. We cannot continue to run away from that issue. And if you think that the war in Yemen and siding with the Saudis on this war makes sense, then you come down to the floor of the Senate, make your position clear, tell your constituents what you believe, and then vote for the war. But have the courage at least to accept your responsibility as a member of the United States Congress and not abdicate it to the President. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.